Hello, everyone, and welcome to my review of Nudgestock 2020. For those of you who don't know what this is, Nudgestock is a conference that runs every year in the UK. It's run by Ogilvy Consulting, and it is oriented around the ideas of creativity and behavioural economics. I was actually planning to travel there this year, attend in person in England, but unfortunately the pandemic threw a spanner in the works. So Ogilvy actually went ahead and decided to make this a completely online experience, and I really enjoyed it. I'm going to give you my final thoughts on the conference at the very end. But firstly, what I'd like to do is walk you through the top takeaways. I have actually 18 of those. Actually, before we get started, one quick thing I wanted to mention. With the Nudgestock event, there was a lot of material, and so I just wanted to give a full disclosure that I didn't attend everything. That would have pretty much been impossible for me. So what I did is I looked at the schedule that was published ahead of time, and I picked out all of the different subjects that were relevant to me. So my agenda is I'm looking for ways to make experience design better. I want better outcomes for experience design. I want better processes. I want better strategies. So a lot of the things that I picked out were relevant to either marketing, they were relevant to emotion, to memory, to research methods. So there were probably a lot of other sessions I didn't go to that had amazing takeaways. So I just want to give that as a quick disclaimer. If they didn't get mentioned, it's because I only went to certain ones that were relevant, and it still packed my whole day. I mean, from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, I was chock-a-block with learning material. But I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that I'm coming at this from a customer experience perspective. Okay, now without further ado, we'll get stuck in. So the first takeaway comes from Luca Delana. He presented in hours 1 to 4, and I've put the time code here so that if you want to go ahead and watch his presentation, you can just use the links in the description to go find this. Essentially what he did is he did a presentation on incentives, and the takeaway was we want positive outcomes, but if we don't have positive emotional associations with the actions to achieve them, we won't do them. And that's very interesting. I've looked at a lot of stuff recently on incentives. There was quite a classic published about motivation that talked about internal versus external motivation. And then you've got the work that came out recently from Nate Andorsky and then Jez Groom's book Ripple. Both had really interesting sections on incentives. But I thought this was a particularly unique takeaway because it focuses you on not just the outcome itself, but on the individual actions and sub-actions that are going to be required to get that person from A to B. The other takeaway that I got from Luca's presentation were that incentives can be encoded as knowledge or emotional association. So if you're in the process of trying to make sure that somebody's going to do something, you obviously want to try and make sure that it's communicated in such a way that the incentive lands in the emotional side rather than the knowledge side. There were 2 presentations at Nudgestock that were head and shoulders above all of the other ones that I saw, and Lucas was one of them. So I highly recommend checking out the presentation that he did. He actually has a book coming out soon as well called The Control Heuristic. So I'm eagerly waiting for that. I'm looking forward to pick it up. But he had some really good insights. So that's why he takes the first 2. The third insight was also in the first block of hours, and it comes from Zihu. I believe that she worked in some kind of capacity around haunted houses and producing and manufacturing fear, for people that want to go on those experiences. And she said that shock does not linger in memory, but fear does. And actually, if you think about it, there's a very good reason for this, because shock is something that it kind of triggers the same area of the brain. When something happens, something that's a surprise happens, the first thing that your brain does is it runs signals in parallel. The first thing that happens is within 150 milliseconds, your amygdala is already aware of what's going on, and it assumes the worst. It releases opiates, and it kind of gets itself all worked up which is what that part of the brain does. There's also a slower process that runs in parallel that goes through the cortex areas that evaluates everything, and then it can calm things down when it assesses the situation. And essentially what happens is with shock, the calming effect takes place and you realize that was nothing that's going to impact me in the future. You got a little bit of, opiates out of it, so it was kind of enjoyable, which is why everybody loves jump scares in the movies. And then you move on with your life. Whereas fear is very, very different. And of course, with fear, there's so many different things going on in terms of like trying to predict what's going to happen. I will make the distinction between fear and anxiety, because a lot of people talk about this when they look at emotions, which is anxiety is the anticipation of something that you can't change. Whereas with fear, there are possible paths that are being generated in your mind to get around fear. And so if your body's trying to figure out ways to move around whatever the thing is that's going to hurt you or penalize you in some way, then your body's going to be memorizing that information better and forming very different levels of attention on it, because obviously it wants to get it right and then remember it so that it doesn't have to endure whatever that penalty is in the future. I really liked Christopher Graves' presentation. He was in the second batch of ours from 9 to 12. He talked about something called cultural cognition. Now, I actually have a book here with me I'm just going to grab. The book I'm looking at now is called Bottlenecks, Aligning UX Design with User Psychology by David C. Evans, published by A-Press. And the reason that I'm bringing this book up is because this has a really interesting section on personality. And they covered a lot of things that he covered in his presentation as well, especially the Big Five. Big Five, anyone who's not familiar with, it's kind of like a Myers-Briggs kind of thing, but it's much more scientifically verified. And there's been a number of studies that have actually showed different marketing messages either resonating or repulsing where people are on those Big Five scales. But one thing this book didn't talk about was cultural cognition. So this was actually brand new to me, and I really like this. Any way that I can find ways to segment customers out, understand different preferences, I'm always looking for things like that, especially from an experience design point of view. And I really like the way that he breaks everything down. So, you're on a hierarchy of either hierarchical to egalitarian or individualist to communitarian. And so I actually looked at myself on this, and I would definitely fall much further on the individualist side and much further on the egalitarian side. I can't remember where I read it. I'm still going through all my notes right now. I've read so many books on just brain science in general and psychology and sociology, but I do know that I've seen it published somewhere that in the Western world, we tend to be much more individualistic, whereas in the Eastern world, we tend to be much more communitarian. And it also tends to change over time. You'll see shifts from age groups as well. So anyway, I thought that was really interesting, a really good takeaway. So if that interests you, then you can obviously look up his presentation by the time code and research that topic further. He also mentioned something called the Disentanglement Principle, which is don't make free reasoning people choose between learning what's known and being who they are. Identity is such a powerful driver in anything that we do, and when you're looking at it from a behavioral change perspective, you always have to remember that identity tends to trump most things. So if you put people in that situation, probably not going to work out well. So always remember that. It kind of leads into takeaway number 6 by Cass Sunstein, the co-author of Nudge, I believe, and also the author of How Change Happens. He talked about a number of phenomena that you can classify that explain change. So there's 4 of them. So the first one was preference falsification. So what he basically says is what you say may not be what is in your head. Of course, if you put people in a situation where there's a mob around them who are telling them you better say this or else, then of course they're going to go along with it. But what do they really think, privately? And so if you've got a toxic culture in a business, people might feel scared to speak up, so they might just go along with everybody else. So that's why he always maintains give people a safe way to be truthful. And he said, honestly, the only way to truly do this at the lowest level is anonymity. That's the only real way. Depending on the levels of trust, there might be other ways above that. But if you're in a really bad environment, then you have to give people at least anonymity to start off with. The next phenomenon is diverse thresholds. So he basically just explained that we all have a different threshold at which we act. And he gave an example of, I think it was a man attacking his son or something like that. And he didn't do anything, but his friend ran in. And then, of course, when his friend ran in, then he ran in afterwards. His friend was much more alert to this kind of thing, felt that he could make much more of a difference. And so, again, with any kind of change operation, some people feel they can step forward and do things. Other people's don't. They might need some other things to take place. So that was another good takeaway from the conference. The next one was social interactions. So he says the twos need to see the ones and the ones need to see the zero. And what this means essentially is there's a video on YouTube, I believe, called How to Start a Movement. It's been years since I've seen it, so don't quote me on the title, but I think that's what it is. But essentially what happens is there's a person... There's some kind of festival going on and someone starts dancing. It's like really bad dancing. They're on their own. A few people are probably laughing at them. And then one or two other people come along and then they start dancing with them. And slowly but surely, over the course of, I think it was 20 or 30 minutes, you end up with hundreds of people just dancing in this field. And none of it would have happened had it not been for that first brave person who was willing to risk ridicule by getting up and doing it. And so that's really what we mean by the zero, and then the ones would be the first kind of early adopters that come along and join in and so forth. So he said that's another very important point when you think about any kind of change effort. And then the final one was group polarization. So individual opinions become more extreme after they are exposed to group discussions of like-minded individuals. So really this is kind of one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of focus groups. If I can get the information off people one-on-one, I much prefer it because of this phenomena. Then Tara Austin came on to talk about lateral thinking, and really what I liked the most about her presentation is she gave everybody a challenge. She said, think about trying to make people behave responsibly by having them wear masks when they go out in public. I want you to come up with a way of doing it. However, what I want you to do is think of the day that you're born on and then find that number in the grid and then use that word. So I'm born on the 10th day of the month, so I got beer, and so I actually did her exercise. And the idea is just to try and help creative thinking, because she said in general the brain doesn't really do this. I know some people can do it very well, I do it very well, but in general most people don't. And that's why we have things like design thinking and so forth to try and help people do that. So anyway, in this exercise, I followed the advice. So I went beer, and then I think my mind associated beer with another nudge that I'd heard of, which is where they got people to use beer mats by customizing them or printing things on that people liked. And then that reminded me of how I recently became a US citizen, and I had my wife buy from Etsy a mask that had the American flag on it. And then I thought, well, you know what? I'm a big Chelsea FC fan, so if there was a mask that had the Chelsea logo on it, then I would most likely wear that. So that would be my answer to her question. And hopefully other people were able to use some of the other numbers to come up with really creative ideas as well. And something like this would be perfect in a design thinking session when you're in the divergent phase. Elke Weber talked about query theory. If you're unfamiliar with query theory, the basic idea is that your preferences aren't stored, they are constructed every time you make a choice. And she says the option which gets considered first gets what she calls the query theory bump. And she showed a bunch of statistics from a bunch of tests that she did that showed that once you can use some ideas like labels and making them attractive and making them align with people's goals and moods, use defaults and so forth, that once you can make someone consider something first, it immediately has a greater chance of being chosen. And this is why I love Nudgestock, because that was a brilliant takeaway that I've not seen anywhere before. I mentioned earlier that there were two presentations that were just head and shoulders above everything else, and everything in general was very good anyway. But this presentation was the other one that was fantastic. This was by Google. It was Claire Sharon and Alistair Rennie, and they talked about something called exploration and evaluation. Now, what that is, if I'm going to zoom in on the diagram here, essentially, if you think about the customer journey when they're buying something, and you have the triggers that start you off, and then you end up in the purchase. The messy stuff that happens in the middle, they have represented this in two phases. Kind of like, again, design thinking, where you have a divergent phase and a convergent phase. So exploration being divergent, looking at different options, and then evaluation, converging down. And this matches really well with a book called The Context Marketing Revolution that I have reviewed on this channel. So go check that review out after you've watched their presentation. I actually think you can combine the two and get maximum value rather than looking at them individually. But this was a really good idea. And what I like the most is that they showed that after surveying the literature and the studies in this field, they found that there were 6 particular strategies that you can use that are related to behavioral economics that can massively help a business infringe on the number one choice in the field, or the number one preference, if you will. And they even showed how this could extend as far as a brand new entrant into the market. And the percentages were quite significant. Now, what I will quickly say is that this was all done through simulation. So they gave people choices of, a mortgage broker, and you get all these different options, and you look at what they're offering. It was simulation. It wasn't real life. And there is when people tell you they're going to do something, it tends to be a little bit different than what they actually do. A book came out recently called The Behavior Business, and I think they were able to put a number on it. I'm not sure how they did it and the research behind it, but they did say it's about 50% of the time. So even with that in mind, the numbers are still impressive. So that's why I thought this presentation was just amazing. And even the guy that was introducing them, he just had his mind blown as well. So go check that one out. That was a really, really fantastic presentation. Next up came Diana Fleischman and Jeffrey Miller. They are a couple who are also both happen to be evolutionary psychologists. They did a presentation about self-care and taking it from the perspective of a Darwinian approach. And so basically what they did is they helped explain why, if a person's not feeling good about themselves, or they're unhappy about certain things, like maybe they were really angry about something, or they were depressed, to understand that those emotions are actually there for a good reason. There can be really good reasons behind them. It's not just because they're a bad person or they're a dysfunctional person. And to try and understand the roots of these things can help you learn more about yourself. So they talked about, now from an experience design perspective, the takeaway that I took away was change the cues, change the associations, change the mood. So of course they were just talking about somebody maybe in their house or business, and things on the wall might remind them of things that upset them, and that can then put them in a bad mood. And if you're someone that suffers from depression, that could have a knock-on effect. For me, what it is when I design experiences, and I kind of knew this anyway, but I wanted to share it with you guys, is be careful about what the cues are, because those cues can have certain associations, and those can change people's moods. I'll give you a really good example. There's a book called The Customer Service Revolution, and in that book, there's an example about someone going into a gas station, I believe, and there are signs that are up in the employee area saying, "Remember to wash hands." And of course, the signal that sends is that the employees haven't been the most sanitary in the past. And of course, that has some really weird associations with people when they go into the gas station. And so then that might make them feel, just a tingle of, like the disgust emotion, or, like feeling very wary, and put them off their food. They may not want to eat there again. So again, all of this stuff is associative. You have to be very, very careful with how it's configured. So that's why I took that away as the big insight from this presentation. Laurie Santos then came on to the next batch of hours, from hours 13 to 14. She's a bit of a legend in Nudgestock, and she talked about happiness. And her takeaway for me was doing something nice for someone else makes you happier, which I thought was a really good point. Sometimes you think of when you do something nice for somebody else as it's just going to make them feel happy, but apparently her science shows and her studies show that actually makes you happier as well. So from an experience design point of view, again, a fantastic takeaway. Evan Hanover then came on to talk about deprivation. This was one I was really looking forwards to. He talked about how deprivation is a common catalyst for reflection. Now, we've all been through the lockdown. We've all been deprived of a lot of things. For me, it's just being able to go out, socialize, be able to eat out at restaurants. And that has caused reflection in my life. And I know it's happened to a lot of other people as well. And I think that's why deprivation as a tool and as a research tool can be very, very important, because it can show you a number of things. I remember even seeing recently when I was reading, I think it was Nate Andolsky's book, and he was talking about what people say in research. And I think he was saying you have to look at not only what people say, but what are they not saying. That can be equally important. So one of my big takeaways was his list of when to use deprivation. So he says use it to isolate and explore routine behaviors, to study future states ahead of large shifts and trends, to validate and explore emerging preferences, to understand levers and pathways to behavior change, to explore product trial and adoption of alternatives, and in a multiple phases of learning. The next takeaway comes from Jack Duddy. He did a tent presentation on the science of experience, an area, again, I'm very, very familiar with. So there was only one thing that was new to me, but I still thought it was really cool, and I wanted to share it in case anybody else didn't know about it. It's called Decompression Zones, which are transition points between the outside world and a business where consumers scan the environment to figure out their next step. You go into a new situation, you're going to be getting information overload anyway. So that's why he mentioned when you go into a supermarket, there tends to be nothing around the immediate area. It's kind of open. And it's because people take around 20 seconds to kind of decompress, get used to the environment, scan it, and then they can get on with what it is they wanted to do. And it's something that's worth knowing, especially for retail, simply because, if you place some products there, they're going to walk right by them. If you place some very important public service announcements, they're going to walk right by them. If they exit from a different place that they enter, then the entry area is probably not where you want to put the bulletin boards where people are offering different services and things like that, because again, people are going to walk right by them. So very, very good takeaway from Jack's presentation. And the last one is time is one of the most costly signals you have. And I've put a book here that talks a lot about costly signaling. I'd never really thought about time in particular. This book has a kind of an evolutionary perspective, and it shows why certain animals put themselves at risk and do things that might look counterintuitive, but it's because when we give the signal that we've put a lot of effort or a lot of cost into something, people who are receiving that signal interpreted it very favorably. So I can't remember which presentation it was in. That's the only sad thing. It was in my notes. It may have been one of the earlier ones, but I can't remember. So I just decided to list it here with the book recommendation. A quick example of where this would be useful is if you had something broken in your house and someone showed up, they fixed it in 1 minute and then charged you $100, you wouldn't feel great. But if they showed up and then they spent an hour fixing it, and then they left, you would feel like the $100 was more relevant, And the person that talked about this even mentioned travel websites and how they could probably, when you put your information in, calculate it really quickly and just bring the page up. But they allow that thing to spin and look like it's doing some really impressive back-end processing, because it gives that feeling that the information you're going to get back is very, very high quality. And of course, high quality is always going to be associated one way or another with a very good customer experience and loyalty. So my final thoughts. Well, this was the best conference that I've ever attended. I thought it had great speakers. It had a list of very diverse topics. I love that it was held on a single day, and I love that there weren't parallel events. It's always frustrating when you've got to make a trade-off between one event or the other. And then, of course, if you, like I did recently, I planned a conference out well in advance, had it all neat and tidy, A month later, I go to the conference and all the schedules changed around. So not only am I trying to figure out what room I've got to be in, nobody seems to know, but then I've also got to remake my trade-offs because they're not one-to-one mappings again. So not having to worry about that was huge. Also, I absolutely hate flying. I just hate the airport experience anyway. If I can get out of flying, I'll do it. I even was considering driving to a conference in Florida recently, which would have been I think a 16-hour drive. I just hate flying so much. So not to not have to worry about that was wonderful. And there was also no annoying conference app that I was forced to install, which was also great. In terms of cons, really, I would just like to have seen 10-minute breaks after every 50 minutes, just because that's more in line with current research on optimal attention. And obviously, we all suffer cognitive depletion, being hit over the head relentlessly with all this great information. And I just think those little breaks would have helped people be a little bit more alert. But other than that, I mean, it was great. So if you've never been to Nudgestock before, I'm not really sure what the plan is for 2021, but I hope to attend these every year. It was just brilliant, and congratulations to Rory Sutherland and the team that put this together, organized it, and executed. It was absolutely fantastic. So that's all from me. Just in case you didn't know who I am and what I do customer experience training. I train people for the Certified Customer Experience Professional exam. I have a book. All the money goes to animal charities because that's a big passion of mine. And I also have an exam simulator and an online training course. So check that out if that will help you. Other than that, I will be back with my traditional book reviews next week. Thanks, guys, and take care.